Shaq was driving home late when something unusual caught his eye. A lemonade stand, open at midnight. But it wasn't just the odd timing that made him stop. It was the boy behind it, no older than 10, counting pennies with shaking hands. His clothes were worn, his face tired, but his eyes held something deeper. A quiet kind of desperation. When Shaq bought a cup and asked, "Where's your mom?" the boy hesitated before whispering, "She's sick. I have to take care of her." The weight in his voice was too heavy for a child. This wasn't just a lemonade stand. This was survival. And Shaq? He wasn't about to walk away. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The fluorescent lights of the small convenience store flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the half-empty aisles. Big Shaq stood in line, checking his phone while waiting to pay for his bottled water. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, except for a tired-looking cashier and a few scattered customers. That's when he noticed the boy. No older than 10, he stood at the counter, hunched over, carefully counting out pennies, nickels, and dimes with trembling hands. His clothes were worn, an old hoodie, slightly too big, sleeves frayed at the edges. His shoes had scuff marks, the soles almost peeling. The cashier sighed loudly, tapping her fingers against the counter. "Kid, you're short." The boy's lips pressed into a tight line. He dug into his pockets, pulling out a few more coins, counting them again, as if hoping the total would magically change. Shaq watched, frowning. People in line behind him shifted, irritated by the holdup. One man sighed dramatically, checking his watch. Someone muttered, "Come on, kid, hurry up." The boy bit his lip, his shoulders tensing under the pressure. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was desperate. Shaq stepped closer, glancing at the counter. A small bottle of cough medicine. "How much is he short?" Shaq asked. The cashier barely looked up. $2.50. Shaq reached for his wallet, ready to cover it. But before he could hand over the money, the boy's small hand shot out, stopping him. His gaze met Shaq's, deep brown eyes, filled with something too heavy for a child to carry. "I can pay you back," he said quickly. His voice was firm, but his fingers clutched the bottle tightly. I just need more time." Shaq's chest tightened. This wasn't just about the money. This boy had pride, responsibility, a burden far bigger than himself. He wasn't just buying medicine, he was fighting for something. And Shaq? He needed to know why. Shaq didn't argue. Instead, he crouched slightly, leveling his gaze with the boy's. "All right," he said, voice calm. "How about this? You tell me your name, and we'll call it a loan." The boy hesitated, fingers tightening around the bottle. Finally, he muttered, "Lucas." Shaq slid a $5 bill onto the counter. "Well, Lucas, looks like you owe me now." The cashier, eager to move the line along, snatched the money and rang up the purchase. She handed the medicine to Lucas, who stared at it for a second before tucking it carefully into his hoodie pocket, like it was the most valuable thing he owned. Lucas nodded at Shaq. "I'll pay you back." Shaq studied him. This kid wasn't just saying it, he meant it, and that made Shaq even more curious. Lucas didn't leave right away. He walked outside, head down, moving quickly. Too quickly, like he didn't want to be followed. Shaq, instincts kicking in, waited a few beats before stepping out himself. He expected to see Lucas turning onto a street, heading home. But instead, Lucas made a sharp right into a dimly lit alley. Shaq's gut twisted. This wasn't normal. Most kids this age would be at home, doing homework, watching TV, not navigating dark alleys after buying medicine with pennies. Shaq exhaled, shook his head, then started walking. He needed to know where Lucas was going, and more importantly, why he was doing this alone. Shaq followed at a distance, his footsteps silent against the pavement. Lucas moved quickly but cautiously, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. He was nervous, as if expecting someone to stop him. Finally, Lucas reached a rundown apartment complex, the kind where paint peeled from the walls and flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows. He slipped inside through the main door, carefully shutting it behind him without a sound. Shaq hesitated. He shouldn't follow. This wasn't his business. And yet, something inside him refused to let it go. Lucas wasn't just a struggling kid. He was carrying a weight no child should bear. And Shaq? He was about to find out just how heavy that burden really was. Shaq waited outside for a few minutes, debating. Then before he could stop himself, he walked toward the building and pushed the door open. Inside, the hallway smelled of dust and old carpet. The walls had water stains. The fluorescent lights flickered dimly, casting long shadows. Lucas had disappeared into one of the apartments. Shaq wasn't going to knock. Not yet. Instead, he moved toward the row of old mailboxes, scanning for a name. And that's when he saw it. A stack of unopened eviction notices, addressed to Amelia Carter, Lucas's mother. Shaq's stomach clenched. This wasn't just about medicine. This was about survival. Shaq stepped back, running a hand over his jaw. Lucas was saving Pennies not for himself, but for his sick mother. They weren't just struggling. They were barely holding on. And Shaq? He wasn't about to walk away. Because now, it wasn't just curiosity. It was personal. And Lucas? He had no idea his entire life was about to change. The night air was crisp, a quiet stillness settling over the dimly lit street. The convenience store's flickering neon sign buzzed faintly behind them as Shaq stepped outside, his eyes fixed on the small boy clutching the medicine bottle. Lucas didn't rush off like Shaq expected. Instead, he stood by the curb, carefully placing the bottle into his hoodie pocket, patting it twice, almost as if making sure it wouldn't disappear. Then, he reached into his other pocket, pulling out the small plastic bag of coins and counting what was left. Shaq frowned. This wasn't normal. Kids his age weren't supposed to be counting pennies on the sidewalk at night, worried about whether they had enough to survive. Curiosity gnawed at him. But more than that, something about this kid didn't sit right. Shaq took a step forward. "Hey, Lucas." The boy's shoulders tensed slightly, like he was expecting a lecture. Shaq kept his voice casual. "Where you headed?" Lucas hesitated. His fingers tightened around the bag of coins. Then, after a long pause, he finally muttered, "Home." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And home is—" Lucas shot him a quick glance, then shook his head. "I gotta go." He turned, stuffing the bag back into his hoodie, and started walking, fast. But Shaq wasn't about to let this go. Shaq followed, keeping his pace measured, not wanting to spook the kid. "Lucas," he called again, softer this time. Lucas stopped mid-step, his back still turned. His small shoulders rose and fell in a deep sigh. Then finally, he turned around. His face was tired, guarded, and too serious for a 10-year-old. "What?" he asked, voice cautious. Shaq studied him, folding his arms. "I don't mean to pry, kid, but that wasn't just any medicine, was it?" Lucas swallowed hard, avoiding Shaq's gaze. "It's for my mom," he finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded, taking a step closer. "She sick?" Lucas hesitated, but something in Shaq's calm expression made him exhale sharply, like he was tired of pretending. "Yeah," Lucas muttered. "Really sick." Shaq's chest tightened. "How long?" he asked. Lucas shuffled his feet. "Couple months now. She can't work." Shaq didn't speak right away. He just let the words settle, watching as Lucas clutched his hoodie tighter around himself, like it was the only thing holding him together. No kid should have to carry this kind of weight. "You got other family?" Shaq asked. Lucas shook his head. "No." Shaq's next question was careful. "Your dad?" Lucas's entire expression changed. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled into fists. "It's just me and my mom." That was all he said. That was all Shaq needed to hear. He had seen that look before. The kind of look that meant the past wasn't just painful. It wasn't an option. Shaq nodded slowly, taking in the full picture. Lucas wasn't just a kid running errands. He was the man of the house. And he was doing it alone. Lucas glanced down at the bag of coins in his pocket and sighed in frustration. "Still short?" Shaq asked. Lucas nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact. I thought I had more. He reached into his hoodie, pulling out a handful of nickels and pennies. Slowly, he started counting them again, his lips moving silently as he did the math. Shaq felt something in his chest tighten. This wasn't about pride anymore. Lucas was holding on to every single cent like it was the difference between survival and failure. Shaq let out a slow breath. You know, he started, keeping his tone light. There's this thing called a job. Pays better than pennies. Lucas gave him a flat look. I'm 10. Shaq smirked. Smart kid. Lucas sighed again, stuffing the change back into his pocket. I can figure it out. Shaq raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Lucas hesitated, then mumbled, I'll find a way. And Shaq believed him. Because this kid wasn't just talking. He was already doing it. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had two options. 1. Walk away. Pretend this wasn't his problem. Let the kid handle it like he clearly planned to. Or 2. Step in. And Shaq knew himself well enough to already know the answer. All right, Shaq said, straightening. You want to pay me back for the medicine? Lucas nodded firmly. Yeah. Shaq pulled out a card from his pocket and handed it over. Then meet me here tomorrow. Lucas took the card carefully, eyeing the address. What's this? Shaq smirked. A way to make more than pennies. Lucas hesitated, staring at the card, then at Shaq. Finally, for the first time that night, the kid cracked the smallest, tiniest smile. Okay. Shaq nodded. This wasn't just about helping. It was about making sure Lucas never had to do this alone again. And tomorrow, Shaq was going to make sure of it. The drive to Lucas's home was quiet. Shaq kept glancing at the boy in the passenger seat, small, tired, too serious for his age. Lucas held the medicine bottle tightly in his lap, turning it over in his hands, as if reminding himself why he had fought so hard to get it. Shaq had offered to take him home, and after a long hesitation, Lucas had agreed. But now, sitting in the dim glow of the streetlights, he looked like he was regretting it. As they pulled up to the rundown apartment complex, Shaq felt a wave of unease settle in his chest. The building was in rough shape, peeling paint, rusted railings, a flickering streetlight casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. A couple of men stood near the entrance, smoking, their voices low and unfriendly. A broken no loitering sign hung lopsided near the door, completely ignored. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You sure you don't want to crash somewhere else tonight? Shaq asked, only half joking. Lucas forced a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's fine. We don't have anywhere else to go. That answer sat heavy in Shaq's chest. Then, before either of them could move, a figure stepped out from the shadows. The first thing Shaq noticed was the smirk. The kind of smirk that belonged to men who enjoyed power, the ones who never had to ask for respect because they took it by force. Nathan Reyes. Lucas immediately tensed, gripping the medicine bottle even tighter. Nathan had the walk of a man who thought he owned the world. His button-down shirt was only halfway tucked in, sleeves rolled up, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. In his other hand, a clipboard. Shaq had seen his type before, a man who played by his own rules, a man who made sure people knew he controlled them. Nathan stopped right in front of them, blocking the entrance. His eyes flicked from Lucas to Shaq, amused. Well, Nathan drawled. Didn't expect a chauffeur service, fancy. Lucas lowered his gaze, his whole body pulling inward. He didn't say a word. Shaq, however, had plenty to say. You're the landlord? He asked, voice level. Nathan grinned, blowing out a slow stream of smoke. I'm whatever I need to be. And right now? His smirk widened. I'm the guy reminding this kid that his mom is 2 months behind on rent. Lucas's hands curled into fists. Shaq's jaw tightened. And sympathy, Nathan continued, doesn't pay the bills. The way Nathan Reyes carried himself told Shaq everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. Nathan wasn't here for rent. He was here to remind Lucas that he owned him. Shaq stepped forward slowly. Lucas's eyes widened slightly, as if warning him to stop. Nathan raised an eyebrow. And who the hell are you? Shaq didn't blink. Someone who doesn't like bullies. Nathan chuckled darkly, shaking his head. That's cute. But unless you're paying their rent, this conversation is over. Lucas flinched at the words. Shaq caught the way his shoulders hunched in defeat, like he had heard this 1,000 times before. Shaq exhaled, slow and controlled. Nah, he said, his voice almost lazy. I think we're just getting started. Nathan's smirk faltered just slightly. You think you're the first tough guy to step in? Nathan asked, tilting his head. It's real sweet. But this isn't some after-school special. The world doesn't work on good intentions. Shaq's lips twitched. That's so? Nathan grinned again, full of smug confidence. You see, he continued, gesturing toward the building. This place? It's mine. And the people inside? They know what happens when you fall behind. Shaq didn't miss the unspoken threat. Neither did Lucas. Nathan took a step closer, lowering his voice just slightly. So, unless you're ready to drop a check on their overdue rent, I'd say you should mind your own business. Shaq tilted his head. You always this chatty with tenants? Nathan's grin widened. Just the ones that need reminding. Shaq nodded slowly. And you enjoy that, huh? Watching them struggle? Nathan shrugged, unconcerned. I enjoy getting what I'm owed. Shaq let out a low chuckle. Nathan's grin faltered, just slightly. Shaq took another step forward, standing just a little too close. Nathan didn't back up, but Shaq noticed his fingers tightening slightly around the clipboard. I get it, Shaq said, voice casual. Power's a hell of a thing, right? Nathan didn't answer. Shaq smirked. But see, guys like you, they always make the same mistake. Nathan scoffed, rolling his eyes. Oh yeah? And what's that? Shaq's expression turned cold. Thinking they're untouchable. For the first time, Nathan's smirk disappeared. Just for a second. A flicker of something. Unease. Shaq held his gaze, his presence unshaken, immovable. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a smirk again. Cute speech, but talk doesn't pay rent. Then he looked past Shaq, directly at Lucas. And your mom's got 5 days before she's out on the street. Lucas stiffened. Shaq? He clenched his jaw so tight it hurt. Shaq had been patient, calculating, but watching Nathan Reyes look at Lucas like he was nothing. That was the final straw. He exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to stay calm. Then, with slow precision, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Nathan frowned. What the hell are you doing? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he pressed a button and lifted the phone to his ear. Yeah, he said casually. I need you to pull everything on a guy named Nathan Reyes. Property records, lawsuits, eviction complaints, anything dirty. Nathan's face twisted in confusion. What the hell is this? Shaq ignored him. Oh, and banking records too. Let's see if the IRS would be interested in those. Nathan's smirk finally vanished. You don't know who you're messing with, he snapped, stepping closer. Shaq didn't move. Neither do you, he said coolly. Silence. Lucas stared at them, eyes wide. Nathan took a breath, then forced a smirk again. But this time, it was weaker. Good luck with that, he muttered, backing up toward the building. You've got 5 days. Then he turned and disappeared inside. Shaq let out a slow breath, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Lucas looked up at him. For the first time that night, his voice wasn't guarded. Who are you? Shaq smirked. Someone who really doesn't like bullies. And as he stared at the apartment door Nathan had disappeared behind, one thing was very, very clear. Nathan Reyes thought he had power. He was about to lose it all. Shaq stepped inside the apartment, and the air felt different. It wasn't just the cramped space or the peeling wallpaper. It was the weight of struggle, the kind that settled into the walls, the kind that stayed in the silence between words. Lucas moved quickly, setting the small medicine bottle on the counter before turning toward the back room. His steps were careful, but urgent, as if he was used to handling fragile things. Shaq's eyes scanned the apartment. It was clean, but empty. A small couch with a tear in the fabric, a wobbly wooden table, and a few dishes stacked in the sink. The air smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner, like someone had done their best to make the place feel fresh, despite everything. And then he saw the papers. A stack of unopened envelopes sat on the counter, bold red letters stamped across the top. Final notice. Overdue balance. Immediate action required. Shaq felt his jaw tighten. Lucas reappeared from the back room walking beside a woman. And in that moment, Shaq understood everything. Amelia Carter, Lucas's mother. She was thin, too thin. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, her hands trembling just slightly as she steadied herself against the wall. But despite all of that, she smiled. Lucas told me what happened, she said softly, glancing at her son. Thank you for helping him. Shaq shook his head. No thanks necessary. She nodded, lowering herself carefully into one of the chairs at the table. Lucas hovered beside her, watching closely, like he was always waiting to step in if she needed help. Shaq saw it then, the way Lucas's entire existence revolved around making sure his mother was okay. The way his eyes flicked toward her every few seconds, as if he was checking to make sure she was still breathing, still strong. And Amelia? She saw it too. She reached out, brushing a hand through Lucas's hair. You didn't have to spend all your savings on medicine, sweetheart. Lucas stiffened. We had to. Shaq felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't just a boy trying to help. This was survival. Amelia turned back to Shaq, her expression guarded but polite. We're fine, she said. Shaq raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? She nodded quickly. Lucas is strong. We're managing. Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his eyes drift toward the pile of unopened envelopes again. She noticed. Her posture stiffened, her hands clasping together in her lap. We'll be fine, she repeated, but this time her voice was quieter. Shaq sighed, leaning against the counter. Lucas is a good kid, smart, brave, but he's also just a kid. He shouldn't be the one carrying all of this alone. Amelia's throat bobbed as she swallowed. For the first time, her mask cracked just slightly. Shaq softened his tone. What are you sick with? The room fell silent. Lucas looked away. Amelia's hands tightened around each other. Then, finally, she whispered it. Stage 2 cancer. Shaq felt his stomach drop. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. Jesus. Lucas sat down beside his mom, his back straight, his face unreadable. Shaq realized then, Lucas already knew. And yet, he had never let himself break, because he refused to let his mom see him scared. Shaq looked at Lucas, searching for any sign of fear, any sign of the child that should have been allowed to just be a child. But Lucas's face was steady. He wasn't crumbling. He was holding everything up. Shaq turned back to Amelia. Are you getting treatment? She hesitated. Lucas immediately spoke for her. She's supposed to. Shaq caught the shift in Amelia's expression, the way her lips pressed together, the way her shoulders tensed. She wasn't telling the truth, and Lucas knew it. Shaq narrowed his eyes. Why aren't you getting treatment? Amelia inhaled sharply. Because I have a son to take care of. Silence. Shaq felt something deep in his chest tighten. Amelia forced a smile. I can't afford to be in a hospital, can't afford to take time off. If I don't work, we don't eat. If we don't pay rent, we lose our home. She gestured toward the envelopes on the counter. And apparently that's already happening. Her voice was too calm. Lucas stared at the table, gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. You can't fight this alone. Amelia's eyes met his, tired but unyielding. I have to. And Shaq understood. This was a woman who had already accepted the outcome. She had already made the choice to put her son first, even if it killed her. Shaq leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. What if you didn't have to? Amelia blinked. What? Lucas looked up. Shaq tapped a finger against the counter. What if there was another way? Amelia sighed, rubbing her temples. Look, I appreciate what you did for Lucas, but we don't need charity. We just need… Shaq cut her off. You need help. She flinched slightly, but Shaq didn't back down. You don't get to decide to stop fighting, he said, voice low but firm. Not when your kid is out there counting pennies just to keep you alive. Amelia's eyes filled with something: anger, frustration, fear. I'm doing the best I can, she whispered. Shaq nodded. I know. But now, you're not doing it alone. She shook her head. We don't... Shaq interrupted again, pushing off the counter and pulling his phone from his pocket. Lucas, he said, keeping his eyes on Amelia. What's the best hospital in this area? Lucas hesitated. St. Jude's? Shaq dialed. Amelia's entire body tensed. What are you doing? Shaq pressed the phone to his ear, waiting. Making sure you don't get a choice in giving up. Shaq stayed on the phone for 20 minutes. He pulled every string he had. Within an hour, Amelia Carter had an appointment with one of the best oncologists in the city. Lucas sat in stunned silence. Amelia looked close to breaking. She wasn't used to people stepping in. She wasn't used to people staying. Shaq tucked his phone back into his pocket and exhaled. You fight for your kid, he said, voice softer now. Now let someone fight for you. Amelia stared at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time that night, her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in relief. Lucas exhaled, looking between them. Shaq met his gaze. And in that moment, Lucas knew. This wasn't just a stranger anymore. Shaq was part of their fight now, and he wasn't walking away. The knock at the door was sharp, demanding. Lucas flinched. Amelia, sitting at the small kitchen table, exhaled quietly before pushing herself up from the chair. Shaq stood first. I got it, he muttered. Amelia hesitated, but when she saw the way Shaq's expression darkened, she didn't argue. Shaq strode to the door and pulled it open, and there he was. Nathan Reyes. He wasn't smirking. Not yet. But there was something smug in the way he stood, holding a stack of papers in one hand, cigarette in the other. Morning, Nathan said smoothly. Shaq didn't respond. He simply crossed his arms, blocking the doorway. Nathan exhaled slowly, flicking the ash from his cigarette. Didn't take you for the roommate type. Shaq's expression didn't change. Nathan's smirk finally appeared. He held up the papers. 5 days, he said casually. That's how long they have before they're out. Shaq stilled. Lucas, standing a few feet back, clenched his fists at his sides. Amelia, though calm, was gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Shaq's voice was calm, controlled. How much? Nathan's grin widened. He loved this part. 4,000. Shaq's eyes narrowed. For 2 months of rent? Nathan shrugged, completely unbothered. Late fees, interest. I make the rules. Shaq could see it now. This wasn't about money. Nathan enjoyed this. He liked seeing people afraid, watching them scramble. And that's when Shaq made a decision. He nodded slowly. Okay. Nathan laughed. Yeah? You got that kind of cash lying around? Shaq's smirk was dangerous. I do, he said simply. Nathan's grin faltered. Then Shaq leaned in, lowering his voice. But I'm not paying you a dime. Nathan blinked. Excuse me? Shaq's gaze didn't waver. I'm taking you down instead. For the first time since meeting him, Nathan Reyes looked thrown off. It was quick, just a flicker of confusion. Then, he scoffed. That's cute, but see, this isn't optional. He waved the eviction notice. They either pay, or they leave. Shaq stepped closer, forcing Nathan to either stand his ground or back up. Nathan stayed, but his smirk wasn't as strong now. You're a slumlord, Shaq said, his voice quiet. And I bet if I start pulling records, I'll find a lot more than just overdue rent, won't I? Nathan's jaw tightened. Shaq smirked. Thought so. Lucas had been silent, his small fists shaking. But now, he couldn't hold it in. This isn't fair, he snapped, stepping forward. Shaq felt a sharp pang of anger on the kid's behalf. Nathan, however, just grinned. Life's not fair, kid. Lucas took another step forward. You don't even care. My mom's sick and you... Lucas, Amelia said softly. placing a hand on his shoulder. Lucas clenched his jaw, breathing hard. Nathan looked completely unbothered. Shaq? He was done. You think this is a game? Shaq asked, voice dangerously low. Nathan chuckled. For me, it is. Shaq nodded slowly. All right. He pulled out his phone. Nathan frowned. What the hell are you doing? Shaq lifted the phone to his ear. Yeah, I need records pulled on a Nathan Reyes. Property violations, tenant complaints, financial fraud, all of it. Nathan's smirk finally dropped. You... Shaq held up a hand. Shh. He turned slightly. Oh, and while you're at it, see if the IRS would be interested in a landlord charging quadruple rent on government-assisted housing. Nathan's face paled. Shaq's eyes never left him. You enjoy watching people squirm, Reyes? He asked softly. Then enjoy your turn. Nathan looked rattled. It was the first real crack in his confidence. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. You don't know who you're messing with. Shaq smiled. Neither do you. Silence. Nathan's fingers twitched around the eviction notice. Then, without another posture. Sir, she said, stepping forward. I think there's been some confusion. Veronica had a... She hesitated, searching for the right words. Bad attitude, but I assure you, our service standards are intact. This was just a lapse in judgment. Shaq raised an eyebrow. A lapse in judgment? His voice was calm, but firm. A lapse in judgment is forgetting someone's drink order. This? He gestured around the restaurant. This is a pattern, and I want to know why. The assistant manager opened her mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. He turned, addressing the staff now, his voice carrying across the dining room. Why has the service here been going to hell? His gaze landed on the nearest waiter, who flinched slightly. Why are customers being treated like they don't belong? The silence was deafening. His eyes swept over the employees, some avoiding his gaze, others shifting uncomfortably in their spots. And then he asked the question that broke everything open. Had already uncovered enough to know one thing. Nathan Reyes wasn't just a bad landlord. He was a criminal. There were records of illegal evictions, falsified maintenance reports, and fraudulent rent hikes disguised as administrative fees. But that wasn't even the worst part. Shaq found whispers of something bigger. Nathan wasn't just profiting off desperate families. He was laundering money. Shaq made one phone call. A friend, someone who knew how to pull records others couldn't touch. Within an hour, the full picture started coming together. Nathan had been moving large sums of untraceable cash through his properties, claiming them as renovation expenses. But here's the thing. There were no renovations, no permits, no construction records, no receipts. Just money moving in and out, disguised under layers of fake paperwork. And then, Shaq found the link. Nathan had ties to loan sharks. Not just any loan sharks, dangerous ones. The kind who didn't take kindly to people who brought unwanted attention to their operations. Shaq leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Nathan had made a lot of enemies. And now, he was about to have one more. The next morning, Shaq made his move. He leaked just enough information to a trusted journalist, one who had been waiting for a case like this. By noon, the first article dropped. Slumlord or scammer, allegations of fraud surface against local landlord Nathan Reyes. Shaq knew it wouldn't take long for the chain reaction to begin, and he was right. Within hours, tenants started coming forward. People who had been too afraid to speak out before suddenly found their voices. Social media blew up. He stole my security deposit. He raised my rent overnight with no notice. I got evicted for asking for hot water. By evening, lawyers were making calls. Nathan Reyes had spent years scaring people into silence. But now, they weren't scared anymore. Shaq wasn't surprised when his phone rang. Nathan's voice was different, tense, frustrated, desperate. What the hell did you do? Shaq smirked. Me? Nothing. I just let people see who you really are. Nathan cursed under his breath. You don't get it, he snapped. You're messing with things you don't understand. Shaq's expression hardened. No, Reyes. It's you who doesn't understand. Silence. Then, Shaq delivered the final blow. Tell me, Nathan, he said, voice calm. Do your business partners know you're making headlines? Nathan's breath hitched. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, I didn't think so. And then, he hung up. By morning, things got worse for Nathan. More legal complaints surfaced. Investigators started digging. And then, the real hit came. Nathan's silent investors, the ones backing his dirty money operations, they found out. Shaq didn't have to do anything after that. Because when criminals realize one of their own has become a liability, they cut him loose. By the time Nathan showed up at Lucas's apartment again, he looked different. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes wild with frustration. The usual cocky arrogance was replaced with something closer to panic, but he still held on to one last shred of power. He knocked on the door, and Shaq opened it. Nathan let out a sharp breath. We need to talk. Shaq didn't move. No, we don't. Nathan gritted his teeth. You think you've won? You think this is over? Shaq tilted his head. Isn't it? Nathan's hands curled into fists. I can fix this, he insisted. I can... Shaq stepped forward, cutting him off. Fix what? The fact that you got caught? Nathan's jaw clenched. For the first time, Shaq saw it, the moment Reyes realized it was over. And then, without another word, Nathan turned and walked away. Because for the first time, he was the one being forced out. A week ago, Lucas counted pennies like his life depended on it. Because it did. Every cent he scraped together had a purpose. Keeping his mother alive, keeping a roof over their heads, keeping hope from slipping away. But today, Lucas doesn't count pennies anymore, and neither does his mother. Sunlight streamed through the apartment window, warm and golden, casting a glow across the small kitchen table where Amelia sat, flipping through a pile of papers. For the first time in months, they weren't overdue notices. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the walls were closing in on her. Lucas sat across from her, kicking his feet absently beneath the chair, scribbling in a worn notebook. He looked lighter, like a kid who had finally let go of a weight he wasn't meant to carry. Amelia set down the papers and exhaled. Lucas, she said softly. He looked up, eyes curious. We're going to be okay. His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something. But then he just smiled, and that was enough. Across town, Shaq sat in a sleek office, tapping his fingers against the edge of a desk. Done, the man across from him said, sliding over a folder. It's official. Shaq picked it up, flipping through the documents. With one final signature, he had bought the entire apartment complex. And Nathan Reyes was never stepping foot in it again. The first thing Shaq did, he wiped out every fraudulent late fee, every illegal charge Nathan Reyes had slapped onto struggling tenants. The second, he brought in a new landlord, someone fair, someone decent, someone who wouldn't treat people like they were disposable. By the end of the week, the apartment complex was no longer a place where fear lingered in the hallways. It was finally a home. And Lucas and Amelia weren't going anywhere. A few nights later, Shaq pulled up in front of Lucas's building. Something immediately caught his eye. There on the sidewalk was a small lemonade stand. But this time, Lucas wasn't hunched over, exhausted and desperate. He wasn't counting pennies like they were all he had left. Instead, he was laughing, talking to people, smiling. And when Shaq stepped out of his car, Lucas's face lit up. Hey, the boy grinned, waving him over. First cup's free for family. Shaq chuckled, walking up to the stand. Lucas handed him a cup, beaming. Shaq took it, raising it slightly. To new beginnings, Lucas nodded. To new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, there wasn't a single trace of worry in his eyes. Because for once, he had won, and Shaq had made sure of it. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. Too many kids like Lucas are forced to grow up too fast, carrying burdens they should never have to bear. But what if we paid attention? What if we stepped in instead of walking away? Shaq didn't just help, he changed a life. And sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to make a difference. So ask yourself, who around you needs a helping hand? Because the smallest act of kindness, it could be the start of someone's new beginning.